It's Dr. Clymer. Sorry, I think this video had a little trouble recording the first time, so I just jumped in to re-record it again. Let's see if we can make this make sense this time. So basically, there are a couple of things about Chapter 4 that sometimes throw students off, especially because we start taking a bunch of different concepts from Chapter 3 and kind of start trying to put them all together, and that can be a little overwhelming. So I'm going to go through a few things that maybe can help you with that process. So let's just see if I can get my computer running here. So you don't have this particular graphic. Just get my mouse and stuff under control here. You don't have this particular graphic in your textbook, but I really like it because it helps to simplify the relationship between cores and peripheries. Chapter 3 talked about this. Chapter 4 talked about this more, but maybe having this graphic will help you. So this is Wallerstein's world system theory model. And what Wallerstein proposes is something that you've already encountered in your book, that there are, in terms of the relationships of one place to another place, sometimes these relationships called core and periphery relationships. Cores tend to be where you see large concentrations of population, of political power, of economic power, and of manufacturing. But peripheries tend to be where you get primary sector raw materials in particular. Now you remember, because we talked about this in conjunction with last week's reaction paper, that raw materials, one of the tricky things about them is they tend to be really low profit because one cocoa bean is pretty much the same as another cocoa bean. There's some variation within that, but ultimately you tend to compete with your price rather than with the exclusivity of your product in the primary sector. So keep that in mind. So what we have here in Wallerstein's world systems theory model, we have economic cores. That's the red thing here. Cores produce high profit consumption goods. That's what these words are in this arc. If you're watching on a mobile or something, that may be tough to make that out, but it says high profit consumption goods. So these tend to be secondary sector and tertiary sector things. You have goods, you have services, you have information. Then over here, the green thing is periphery. And one of the things Wallerstein does that's really interesting is he classifies not just raw materials as something that comes from a periphery, but also cheap labor. And now the first time I heard that theory, it kind of rubbed my fur the wrong way, frankly. I was, good heavens, cheap labor? I was a college student. I was a waitress. I worked overnight shifts at a restaurant. And the idea that I was a raw material was a little disturbing. Then again, I took this idea and started to chew on it, and then I watched what happened over the next couple of weeks as I had coworkers come and go. Some quit, some got fired, some just didn't show up anymore. And you know what we did? We replaced them with another human being that was just as non-specific as the ones that had come through the door the first time. It turns out, in terms of that particular job, it was considered unskilled labor, and one person was about as good as another to that particular employer. So while I didn't necessarily like the idea, I think Wallerstein's onto something. So if you have one of those jobs where if you quit today, they would hire some other person tomorrow and replace you at the drop of a hat, then you maybe can relate to what Wallerstein's getting at. But what tends to happen is peripheries tend to be lower income. They tend to produce goods that are worth less money, and they tend to be where the labor and the raw materials come from as they flow into an economic core. So the core produces the secondary and tertiary sector goods. The periphery supplies the labor and the raw materials to the core. And now one of the things that's important about this relationship is that the periphery is low profit, but they do get their manufactured goods from the core. Not that many people who work in the periphery actually manufacture their own clothing, their own tools, their own radios, things like that. So this relationship suggests, this graph almost kind of suggests that all of the high profit consumption goods go into the periphery. The reality is the core buys most of its own stuff. So if you go into a city that has a factory and that factory is manufacturing blue jeans and sneakers, most of those things are going to be purchased by people in that core. But some of the surplus is going to flow into the periphery because they're not doing their own manufacturing. So then we have this interesting critter called the semi-periphery, and it's this blue thing here in the center. And the thing about a semi-periphery is it's going to behave as a core to a periphery, but it's going to behave as a periphery to a core. So one of the interesting ways to think of this is look at some of those medium-sized cities that we have around here. Now, the town I came from in Missouri had about 400 people in it. So when we went to Joplin, we had really gone somewhere. This was a big, robust, gigantic city in my mind. On the other hand, I had friends from Kansas City and St. Louis who would go to Joplin and say, wow, this place is tiny. There is nothing to do here. So that difference of perception comes in part into play when we consider in this model. Joplin was functioning as a semi-periphery. For people from the periphery, they would use that semi-periphery as a core. But for people from the core, from larger, more robust economic centers, they definitely looked at it more as a periphery. So a semi-periphery is not exclusively home to primary, secondary, or tertiary sector goods. It actually does some of all of the above, but it supplies mostly secondary and tertiary sector goods and services to the periphery, while supplying mostly primary sector goods and services to the core. So the semi-periphery engages both sides at the same time, but in different ways. So hold on to that theory, because that's one of the things that's going to help us make sense of what we're going to see next. So moving forward then into Europe. Oh yeah, I forgot I had this map here. This map just shows you one interpretation of where the world's cores and peripheries are. And as we've discussed before, the mid-latitudes seem to have a tremendous economic advantage. Not only are almost all of our economic cores, in fact, all of our economic cores located in the mid-latitudes, but most of our semi-peripheries, these purple countries, are as well. So you remember from chapter 3, we have LDCs, less developed countries, we have MDCs, more developed countries, and then we have these critters in the middle called NICs, newly industrializing countries. NICs are our semi-peripheries, effectively. So down here at Brazil, I think it's an excellent example. Brazil functions largely as a periphery to the United States. We're a core country. Most of what we get from Brazil is not manufactured goods. Most of what we get from Brazil is raw materials like soybeans and tropical fruits and some beef, things like that. On the other hand, Peru, right over here, is a periphery country, and most of what Peru gets from Brazil is actually manufactured goods. So the relationship is different depending on the economic status of the country that's sort of coming into the relationship with Brazil. So moving right along then, this map shows you purchasing power density, which is an unnecessarily complicated way of saying money in Europe. And it's actually broken up. One of the things I love about this is these little patches, instead of being whole countries, are regions of countries. These are kind of like our counties a little bit. And so what you see is, you know, sometimes you'll have a country like Spain that has some spots that are really, really wealthy and some spots that are definitely not. And this kind of lets you see that nuance. It's really kind of nice. So your textbook in chapter 4 talks about the European core. It identifies United Kingdom all the way down to Italy, and this kind of stretch in between here. This is where we find the largest cities, the most dense populations, most of the economic power, most of the political power, and most of the higher level manufacturing and tertiary sector productivity. So as we look at this map that shows us income levels, what we see is that very much corresponds to the same core that your book talks about. There's one kind of subtle thing I want to point out here. Norway and Sweden and Finland are actually all three fairly wealthy. What's going on here where they've got all these spaces with just no data, this is the Arctic Circle. Most of the people in Sweden and Norway and Finland live really close to the ocean because then they get that benefit of the North Atlantic drift. It's not as cold. So if you go deeper into Norway and Finland and Sweden, basically you just find not very many people live there. And with not very many people living there, nobody else is generating money. It's not really something that, you know, wolves do for fun or anything. So anyway, this just shows you, basically, we've got a very wealthy strip of Europe that ranges from the United Kingdom all the way down through Italy. And then we've got more impoverished Europe coupled with some very wealthy sort of pockets here on the Iberian Peninsula. This is Portugal and this is Spain. Over here, Greece, you can tell where the tourist traps are. That's where the money is. The rest of Greece is struggling economically. And then we come over here to Eastern Europe, and this is going to be really important here in a few minutes. Notice that Eastern Europe is way less wealthy than Western Europe. That's going to be important in a second. So this is our population distribution. It shows you where the biggest cities are. And we see that that pretty well corresponds to where we saw those concentrations of wealth. Even when you come down here onto the Iberian Peninsula, where we saw that big difference between really rich cities and really poor countryside, look, we see the same thing. Concentrations of population where we saw concentrations of wealth. So moving right along then. This is where we begin to combine a lot of stuff together. It's where I get excited. So Europe today has had actually some relative success with their experiments in unifying under the European Union, opening up bigger markets, becoming post-industrial. But what we talked about last week, when we talked about chapter 3, you can see very much at work over here. When you look at this population pyramid, look what happens when you go from the parent generation down to the kid generation, or even from this parent generation down to this kid generation. There's a birth dearth, as Europe calls it. There are not very many families having even 2 children, let alone having 3 or 4. So the net result, because most families are having 2 or fewer kids, is that the population is actually shrinking. We talked about the liability of this before a little bit, but we're just going to revisit it right quick. So the funny thing about this is when a population becomes wealthy, they do stop having large families typically. I mean, the Duggars notwithstanding, generally speaking, families with a lot of money tend to not have very many children. So Europe runs into this awkward situation that as the European Union gets wealthier and wealthier, families become smaller and smaller. And on one hand, that's just a byproduct of success. So you could look at this and say, wow, this means we're doing really well economically in the European Union. On the other hand, we have this interesting problem. This generation, this 20 years worth of people are going to have to take over the jobs of this 20 years worth of people. And at the same time that they do that, they're going to have to provide care for this giant generation. And you know how many people this generation is providing care for? This generation. So effectively, as life expectancies get longer and as this large part of the population is kind of aging out of the workforce, this other interesting thing is happening, that there aren't enough young working people to make up that difference. And so Europe looks at the birth dearth and they say, well, we're really happy, we're economically well off. I mean, and who wouldn't be? I think that sounds nice. But what do we do about our workforce? So the first thing they tried, as you probably read in your book, is this really interesting thing called offering baby bounties. They would actually pay people extra money every year if they had children. And in some countries, this added up to a substantial amount of money. In Germany, mothers who had given birth could take off of work for almost a year at 2/3 of their normal pay. That's kind of a big deal. But you know what? If money was the issue, these are the people who can afford to have kids. These are the wealthiest countries in the world. So clearly, money isn't what's holding them back. And so the baby bounties were experimented with and they failed because it was never about the money. So the next question emerges. Obviously, Europe has a problem. They don't have enough of this younger population, and they need somebody to take care of this older population and even this older population. So what are they going to do? They couldn't get people to have larger families by offering them cash. That's not what's motivating people. So instead, they're going to look to another supply of human beings, and that is migrants. So the thing about migration, and again, this is a chapter 3 subject, but I'm going to review it here because it'll help make chapter 4 make more sense. The thing about migrants is a lot of countries who are in this post-industrial pattern acknowledge that they need more people, and they look to migrants willingly. I know in the United States, this is kind of a controversial subject, and some people love immigration and some people don't. And the thing is, Europe has this population pyramid. And because their population pyramid looks like this, it's really not controversial there. People may like it, they may dislike it, but the fact that they need it is really not that much in question. The big debate in Europe is, where should those migrants come from? So moving right along then, you have 2 basic categories of people motivated by 2 basic different systems who become migrants. So a migrant is just a person who is relocating. So if they are immigrating with an I, they're coming into somewhere. If they're emigrating with an E, they are leaving somewhere. So if I were to take a job in the Virgin Islands, I would emigrate with an E from Missouri into the Virgin Islands. So I would immigrate with an I to Virgin Islands. So an immigrant is also necessarily an emigrant at the same time. That's not at all tricky for college students, right? You got this. So we have 2 basic things that motivate people to immigrate. The first would be pull factors, things that are drawing them to a new opportunity. It looks creepy when my hands are disembodied like that. Sorry. But if, for instance, I got a job offer, maybe I get to be the professional puppy petter for the University of Jamaica. I will get to hang out in Jamaica on the beach petting puppies. I would be down with that. That sounds like a really fantastic dream job. I don't think it exists, but if it did, I would apply. So that's pull factors. If I decide to take that job and go to Jamaica, I'm responding to those pull factors. I'm being made an offer that's so attractive that I'm being drawn to that place. But there's some advantages to that. So when a person is responding mostly to pull factors, they're what we call a selective migrant. A selective migrant has selected the place that they are going to go on the basis of some opportunity that it offers. So first of all, I'm probably going to go somewhere that speaks a language that I speak. I'm going to go somewhere that is culturally compatible with what I want. I'm probably not going to move to Saudi Arabia. The people there are very nice, but it's just not culturally what I'm comfortable with. I like wearing trousers and shooting my mouth off occasionally. So I'm more inclined to choose somewhere that is linguistically, culturally, economically compatible with what I want. I have choice. But the thing about choice is it's always a bit of a luxury. So we have the flip side then. Countries want selective migrants. Countries like, like most of the countries in the European Union. I'm going to pick on Germany because we looked at them last week and they're very post-industrial. They're having a hardcore birth dearth. So Germany wants selective migrants. First of all, because Germany knows they need migrants. They need someone to do the work. But they don't necessarily want just any guy who stumbles in off the streets. Selective migration is optimal because they have people who want to be in Germany, who speak the language, who understand the culture, and who want to become integrated into that society. And importantly, selective migrants tend to have two things that are tremendously advantageous to them. They have a little money in their pockets, and they tend to have a little bit of education or some kind of special skill. So then we're going to cross the road over here. We're going to look at the alternative. So if selective migrants are responding to pull factors, they're being drawn to a specific opportunity. Our non-selective migrants are actually responding to push factors. Something is actually repelling them away from the place that they are and encouraging them to go somewhere else instead. Hey, look, there's my cat. So a non-selective migrant typically is fleeing some kind of condition in their home country or in their home space. Sometimes they're internally displaced. But a selective migrant, for instance, might be leaving their home country because they're facing plague or famine or war or starvation or unemployment. Maybe they don't have economic opportunities. So the thing, what I would compare a non-selective migrant to for practical purposes is imagine you're hanging out in a building and the building catches on fire. Your priority becomes to get out of the building, right? You don't care if you go out the front door or the back door or the side door or hop out of the window. The priority is not to get to a specific place. The priority is to get out of the place that you're in. You're responding to something that's pushing you away. That is what non-selective migrants are doing. So they tend to be driven out for some reason. So we saw this very much with the war in Syria. If you watched the Syrian migrant crisis unfold in the last few years, that's exactly what's going on. War in Syria was pushing people out of their home country. So the tricky thing is non-selective migrants are fairly readily available because they are less concerned about where they go than that they get the heck out of where they are. So if a country like Germany was just to throw open its doors and say, hey, come here, then they would easily fill up their labor force with non-selective migrants. So the tricky thing about that, countries, as I mentioned, non-selective migrants are readily available, and yet countries seem to prefer selective migrants. Why is that? Well, non-selective migrants, first of all, are less likely to have chosen their destination for any reason. So they don't necessarily speak the language. They don't necessarily understand or feel compatible with the culture. Maybe just as importantly, non-selective migrants tend to be fleeing a crisis, so they don't typically have money to set themselves up in a new country. And very often, they also don't have as much education as selective migrants. So if you look, for instance, at the medical profession right now, a lot of the new pediatricians, especially coming into the United States right now, are coming from Southeast Asia. They're coming from India, they're coming from Pakistan, they're coming from Sri Lanka, they're coming from Indonesia. They're very well trained, very well qualified, and they're coming to the United States as selective migrants. You are less likely to find that scenario with non-selective migrants, that they would be that well educated and fleeing persecution, although it does happen, and it certainly happened in Syria. So, because non-selective migrants haven't necessarily chosen their destination on the basis of compatibility, there are sometimes concerns for countries about how exactly they are going to integrate these new people. Are they going to need financial help? Are they going to need language training? Are they going to need skills training? And so non-selective migrants are more readily available, but countries, given the choice, find that selective migrants are easier to bring in and easier to integrate immediately into the economy. So I promise, all relevant to Europe. Here we go. So these are the members of the European Union, and the members of the European Union, interestingly enough, did not all come in at the same time. The European Union was formed right after World War II, and it started with just a few countries that were all actually already industrial. They were already manufacturing powers, or had been at least before the war. A lot of them were struggling somewhat after having been nearly blown off the map during World War II, but they were trying to mend fences. So what you see here, and this map is in your textbook, I encourage you to take a good hard look at it. We see the year that various countries joined the European Union. And what we're going to look at here is that progression, what people wanted in 58, what people wanted in 73, all the way to what the European Union wanted from its members in what we call Europe's Big Bang, this moment when membership in the EU kind of changed directions. So we start with these early members. Notice, interestingly enough, UK was not an original member of the European Union. They were interested in being, but actually France sort of blackballed them, thinking that it wouldn't necessarily enjoy as much prestige if England was also there, because they thought that UK was going to overshadow them a little bit politically and economically. So they actually were not invited to the party at first. But anyway, we have these countries. A lot of them didn't really like each other that much. I mean, Germany and France and Belgium had like literally been at war with each other like 5 minutes before the formation of the European Union. So this is actually kind of a big deal that they're going to be united together politically like this. But they are. So they become the core members of the European Union, and their objective, they are all manufacturing powers. Their objective was bigger markets, because if you have bigger markets, everybody can make more money. So if I'm, say, the best baker in the world, I'm not, but let's say I am, and I make cinnamon rolls. If I only have 10 people who are buying my cinnamon rolls, I can sell them cinnamon rolls until they're stuffed, and I'm still not going to necessarily retire a wealthy lady because 10 people can't eat that many cinnamon rolls. But if I expand my market, if I sell to 10,000 people or even 1 million people, then suddenly my opportunity to make money is bigger because my market is bigger. So the goal of the European Union was to open markets so that all of these industrial powers could actually share business with each other, and they could have expanded larger markets, and as a result, everybody would have more economic opportunity. Importantly, these are all core countries with core goals. They wanted to do business with each other as core countries. 73, our first wave of new members. Ireland, UK, Denmark, all of them industrial stage 2, stage 3 economies. Sorry, not stage 2, stage 3. Secondary sector, tertiary sector economies. All right. 81 to 86, we see this interesting thing happen where the EU brings in some slightly poorer countries with some wealthy spots in them. You remember, you noticed before, I pointed out Portugal had some wealthy cities, Spain has some wealthy cities, Greece has some wealthy parts. But for the most part, these countries have some very wealthy and some very poor sections. So this was a significant experiment, actually, and for a while, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, PIGS, becomes sort of an interesting controversy within the EU because they were providing them with so many subsidies and so many extra sort of financial incentives to help them do well. But it works out. So the next wave of new members, 1995, once again, developed countries, Austria, Sweden, Finland. So this interesting thing happens in 2004. The EU changes its priorities. So I'm going to jump back to a couple of graphics you've already seen to help draw this home, okay? So the first one we're going to come back to is this population pyramid. By the early 2000s, this birth dearth had been going on for a while, and it was just getting worse. And so this birth dearth awakened an awareness that the EU had expanded and expanded and expanded as a core, but the problem it had was a lack of labor. Where does labor come from? Well, according to Wallerstein, you remember, as we looked at up here, cheap labor, unskilled labor, the labor that's going to take care of senior citizens and run the restaurants and sweep the streets, come from peripheries. So the European Union changes gears. It looks at its birth dearth, and it looks to the distribution of wealth in Europe, and it says we need a periphery. This will give us migrants, but it will give us European migrants who will be selective migrants. They will be culturally compatible. They will be linguistically compatible with Western Europe. And so the EU from 2004 to 2007 undertakes its largest ever boom of new members in what's called Europe's Big Bang. And these new members, as you saw on the income maps before, were all poor countries. But why? Because the EU changed its goals. This wave of membership, it wanted cores. This wave of membership, it wanted cores. But now its objective is peripheries. They need to fix the labor problem. So they bring the periphery into the European Union in Europe's Big Bang in order to address the problem that your textbook calls the birth dearth. I hope that helps some of your texts make a little bit more sense. Feel free to shoot me an email if you need any help. I really do love hearing from you guys. I am homebound in this space right now, and I won't lie, I'm having fun, but I really do like hearing from you. So please, if you need anything at all, speak up. I'm on your side. I really look forward to seeing you guys finish this class strong. Take care. Bye.